It began with a single step, barefoot on his towel. I didn't mean to do it. It was an accident. But Caleb's sharp voice cut through the lazy afternoon air like a blade. I froze, still pressing my foot into the soft, damp fabric as the sun blazed overhead. But the heat in his eyes burned hotter. I mumbled, stepping back and brushing at the towel with my toes, pretending it wasn't a big deal. But Caleb didn't let it go. He stood taller than me, his shirtless body glistening with pool water droplets. "You didn't see it?" he asked, his voice low, almost teasing. But there was something else, a tension that made my stomach tighten. I swallowed. Trying to ignore it, he stepped closer. And all of a sudden, the air felt too small, and my heart pounded as his fingers touched mine. "You're always so careful, Evelyn." He murmured his words dangerously soft, always so in control. I couldn't breathe. I should have moved. I should have laughed it off. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, my pulse racing, and let the moment hang between us, charged, forbidden, and completely out of control. I spent the rest of the afternoon pretending nothing had happened. Caleb lounged by the pool, scrolling through his phone, acting like his words hadn't turned my world upside down. But I couldn't focus. My book sat open in my lap, unread. My eyes kept drifting to him, the way his muscles flexed as he stretched, the glint of sunlight reflecting off the water droplets clinging to his skin. I hated how aware I was of him. When he dove into the pool, I thought I'd finally get a break. But then he resurfaced, his hair slicked back, and caught me watching him smirked. My cheeks burned, and I turned away too quickly, nearly knocking over my drinking in the process. He called out, his voice echoing across the yard. I ignored him and buried my face in my book. But the words blurred, and my mind raced. I kept replaying the way he looked at me, the way his voice had dipped low and deliberate when I finally dared to glance up again. He was leaning against the edge of the pool, elbows resting on the tile, watching me. I should have gone inside. I should have put distance between us. Instead, I stayed. And when he pulled himself out of the water and walked toward me, droplets trailing down his chest, I couldn't move. "Relax," he said, his voice teasing. "I'm just grabbing my towel." But the look in his eyes told me he knew exa what he was doing to me, and I hated how much I wanted him to keep doing it. That night, the house felt too quiet. Richard was still out of town, and Caleb had retreated to his room hours ago. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped onto the patio. The glow of the pool lights shimmered across the water. But instead of feeling calm, I felt restless. I couldn't stop thinking about him, the way his gaze lingered too long, the way his voice dipped when he said my name, the way he'd stood just close enough for me to feel the heat radiating off his skin. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly, trying to steady myself, but then I heard the sliding door creak open. Caleb stepped outside, barefoot and shirtless, the dim light casting shadows across his toned body. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice softer than before. I shook my head, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt in my silk robe. "Just needed some air." He stepped closer to his eyes, never leaving mine. "Me too." My pulse quickened. I turned toward the pool, trying to focus on anything but him. "It's late. You should go to bed." "Must I?" I opened my mouth to tell him to stop and remind him that this was wrong. But before I could do so, he moved too close, and Evelyn's voice dropped almost to a whisper, telling me to leave. The voice was playful, but when I looked at him, there was nothing playful about the way he was looking at me. I couldn't. Instead, I stood there frozen as his fingers brushed against mine, slowly, deliberate, testing the boundaries. I wasn't sure I could keep any more of his fingers tightened around mine. And I felt my breath hitch. I should have pulled away, I knew it. But instead, I let him step closer. So close I could feel the heat radiating off his body. "Caleb." My voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me to stop," he said again, his eyes dark and locked on mine. I didn't. Instead, my free hand came up, brushing against his chest, hesitant at first, but then lingering. His skin was warm, still damp from the pool, and I hated how good it felt. "Evelyn." My name rolled off his tongue like a secret, like a promise, before I could stop myself. I leaned in, his lips brushed against mine softly, at first testing, waiting, and then I broke. I gripped his shoulders, pulling him into my mouth, crashed against his. The kiss was rough, desperate, and I could feel how much he wanted this. Wanted me. His hands slid down my sides, gripping my waist and pulling me closer until there was no space between us. Bold scene begins. His lips trailed down my neck, hot and urgent. Leaving a trail of goosebumps in their wake, my robe slipped from my shoulder, and his fingers brushed my bare skin, making me shiver. I gasped as his hands moved lower, exploring every inch of me like he'd been waiting for this moment forever. We stumbled back against the patio chair, but neither of us stopped. His mouth claimed mine again, deeper this time, and my fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. Refusing to let go of the sound of the pool's filter hummed faintly in the background. But it faded into nothing as I melted into him, losing myself completely. The bold scene ends when we finally pulled apart. We were both breathless. "This is wrong," I whispered. But my voice shook. "Then why does it feel so right?" I had no response as he said, his forehead on mine, and as he drew me back into another kiss, I knew I no longer cared. I woke up the following morning still replaying the previous night's events, including his touch, his voice, and the way he made me forget everything else. But as the sunlight streamed through the windows, reality hit me hard. I kept telling myself that this couldn't happen again as I stood in the kitchen, clutching my coffee as if it could somehow steady my shaking hands. Then, Caleb entered the room, shirtless, his hair disheveled, as if he hadn't slept either. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the tension from the previous night pressing down on us. "Do we?" he asked, stepping closer, and I backed up, placing the counter between us. He raised an eyebrow, but even as I said that, my resolve was already faltering. "Don't lie to yourself, Evelyn," he said, his voice low and dangerous. I swallowed hard. "It doesn't matter. It was a mistake, was it?" He leaned on the counter, his eyes locked on mine because it didn't feel like one. I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could, he rounded the counter, closing the distance between us. Bold scene begins. He didn't stop until I was backed against the wall, his body pressed against mine. "Tell me to stop," he said again, his breath hot against my neck. I couldn't. His hands slid down my sides, gripping my hips and pulling me closer. His lips found mine and I melted, giving in to the heat and the hunger building between us. I shouldn't have let it happen, not again. But his touch made it impossible to think. His hands explored every inch of me, pushing me to the edge, making me lose control. And this time, I didn't even try to stop it. Bold scene ends. When it was over, we stood there in silence, both of us breathing hard. "This is dangerous," I whispered. "Then let him stop pretending," he said, brushing his thumb against my lip. But we both knew we weren't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The days blurred after that. Every glance, every accidental touch felt charged with electricity. We tried to act normal, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the stolen moments behind closed doors. It was the way he looked at me when Richard was in the room, the way his hand would brush mine at the dinner table, and how I'd catch him staring when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I knew we were pushing our luck. And then it happened. Richard came home early. I was in the kitchen, still heated from the thought of Caleb's hands on me earlier that afternoon. I heard the door open, but I forced a grin as I turned to face him. His eyes were alert, looking around the room, and I heard that the meeting had been canceled. I swallowed and nodded, saying, "I'll get you something to eat." He remained still, leaning against the door frame and crossing his arms. "Where is Caleb? You've been acting strangely lately, Evelyn." And I froze in his room. I assume Richard didn't answer. He simply kept staring at me with a heavy gaze. "What are you saying?" I tried to act normal, but my hands were shaking as I reached for a glass. "Everything was okay?" Caleb asked, his voice calm. "Hey," Richard said casually, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge like nothing was wrong. But Richard didn't take his eyes off me, and in that moment I knew he knew. Richard didn't say anything at first, but the tension in the room was suffocating. "You tell me." I opened my mouth to respond, but then I noticed the flicker of suspicion in Richard's eyes as he walked in. "You tell me." Richard froze, and for the first time, I saw doubt flicker across his face. I began, but he interrupted me because his voice was low, and even though I opened my mouth to lie and deny everything, the words felt hollow to me. Richard's jaw tightened, and I thought, Just don't. His voice boomed through the kitchen, and I flinched, but Caleb didn't move. Instead, he squared his shoulders and stepped closer, his eyes fixed on Richard's. "It's not her fault," he said. "It's mine." But my voice broke as I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. He shook his head, his eyes full of something darker, betrayal and disbelief. "This is unbelievable," he muttered as he stepped back. I reached for him, but he jerked away, saying, "I can explain," I said, desperate now. "Don't bother." And he snapped, "I'm done." Then he turned and left, slamming the door behind him, leaving a deafening silence behind him. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so hard it hurt, and Caleb reached for me. "Evelyn," pulled away, panic rising in my chest. "What did we do?" He continued steadily. "We didn't mean for this to happen." But I could see the panic in his eyes. "We fix it. Richard knows that everything is ruined." So I chuckled sourly, tears already welling up in my eyes. I looked up at Caleb as he stepped closer, his hands gripping my arms. And for a moment everything stopped. His touch calmed me even as everything else was going out of control. And when his lips touched mine, I forgot the guilt, the fear, and the consequences, desperate for the solace that only he could provide. I melted into him and let his hands slide down my back until I could feel his heartbeat against mine. He whispered, "We shouldn't," even as I allowed him to push me against the counter. "But we are," he said, his lips trailing down my neck and leaving me breathless. My robe slipped off my shoulders and gathered at my feet, and his hands moved all over my body as if he was claiming me again. I gasped as he lifted me onto the counter, his body pressing against mine, leaving no space between us. And for those brief moments, nothing else existed. The scene ended, and we stood there in the dim kitchen, both of us gasping. But the guilt hit me hard. "This can't keep happening," I said, pulling away, and Caleb caught my wrist. "Richard is gone. Caleb is here, and I'm not sure whether Hune will return." His jaw clenched. "So what now?" "You don't mean that I do." So I pushed myself to stare at him in order to ignore the pain in my chest. The home felt lonely without Richard, but the weight of his absence permeated every room. I sat on the couch, gazing at my phone, waiting for a text or call, but nothing ever arrived. Caleb walked behind me as I gulped hard, the weight of everything slamming down on me. "I don't know," I mumbled. "He suggested that you speak with him." I gave a headshake. "Who am I?" Caleb firmly said. "I'm sorry. I destroyed our marriage." "You didn't destroy it." We turned to face him and interrupted him. "We did this," he said, stepping closer to us both. His eyes were dark with frustration. "You're acting like it wasn't real, like this was some kind of mistake." I got up, my voice shaking, and said, "It was real." That's the issue with his hand suddenly reaching out and seizing my wrist. "What if I don't regret it?" I froze, gasping for air. His voice was softer this time as he inquired, "Do you feel bad about it?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to stop it there, but I let him pull me closer instead. A bold scene started when his lips found mine, and I gave in. His hands slid under my shirt, pushing it up and over my head before trailing down my back. I gasped as he lifted me and carried me toward the stairs, and every step felt like crossing another line. But I couldn't stop. By the time we got to my bedroom, there was no turning back. He laid me down on the bed, his mouth trailing down my body, leaving a path of heat and need. I arched into him, my fingers tangled in his hair, and pulled him closer. His touch was desperate, almost possessive, as if he needed to prove that I was his now. And I was bold. I propped Caleb up on one elbow and brushed a strand of hair out of my face. I whispered to him, "We'll figure it out." But I wasn't sure because I knew deep down that this wasn't a love story. Rather, it was a disaster waiting to happen. I woke up tangled in Caleb's arms, feeling the warmth of his body against mine. For a moment, I allowed myself to pretend that this was normal and that we weren't living on borrowed time. But the illusion was shattered the moment I saw my phone. I slipped out of Richard's, my heart thumping, and he answered on the first ring. Evelyn, his voice tight and raw. I'm sorry, I replied right away, my eyes burning. Don't cut me off. You don't get to apologize after what you've done. I put my palm to my lips in an attempt to stop myself from crying. Please, Richard, he begged, his voice cracking. I cherished you, he finally stated. You need to make a decision because I'm not going to sit around waiting for you to figure out what you want. I had no words because I trusted you, and you threw everything away for him. Caleb stood in the doorway, his brows wrinkled as I fell to the ground. Trembling, what took place? I was standing at the edge of a cliff, forced to choose between the man who had been my stability and the one who made me feel alive. Which would you choose, the forbidden passion that could destroy everything or the safe, steady love? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that cross every line. I looked up at him, my voice barely a whisper, and he knelt beside me, his hand resting on my knee. Perhaps that's what we need, a fresh start. But was it because, as much as I wanted Caleb, I couldn't escape the guilt eating me alive call to action?